Hey everybody, this is Derek Radney. I'm a pastor at Trinity Church in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. This is the first time I've ever done a video or a podcast like this. Normally, I do videos that are made for my church, and they're kind of aimed at instructing committed Christians, like in the faith, teaching them about Christianity. This video is a little different. This is meant to speak to non-Christians and to people who are seeking answers, kind of asking the big questions in life, or maybe those who are in the Christian church but are really doubting their faith. And so my hope is that this video will lead you to take seriously the claims of Christianity. And the reason for this is that I believe Christianity is good for the world. It's good for each individual. It's beautiful, and it brings a beautiful life. And then ultimately, I'm doing this because I think Christianity is true. Now, I haven't come to this position lightly. Most of my adult life has been dedicated to studying the big questions of life. And I've done this, dialoguing with others, reading pretty widely on different religions and philosophies. So this has been a long journey for me as I've gotten deeper and deeper into the Christian tradition and what Christians have historically believed, and I've just found it increasingly compelling. And I'm a pastor, obviously, so I've sort of built my life around this. But it's a hard subject to bring up with people. It seems very out of place at times. People don't feel like you're kind of shoving your faith down their throats, and so I don't really want to do that, but I do want to kind of explain why I think Christianity should really be given a lot of consideration. And there's a lot of things to discuss when it comes to this subject, of course, like the existence of God, the problem of evil or the problem of pain, whether or not Christianity is good for the world, morally and otherwise. And those are all important questions, but I really want to focus on the central question, the one that really impacts how we wrestle with all the other ones. And in one sense, how you answer this question can really shape how we investigate all those other ones. So before I get into all that, I do want to say everything I'm going to be saying today is not unique to me. It's not like I came up with all this. I'm really pulling together arguments and sort of looking at all these things that I've researched and trying to compile them into kind of a compact and tight sort of argument. So I'm not claiming any of this is original to me, but I do hope that if you know me, that, and this may not be the case for all of you, but if you know me, that you might be more willing to consider these arguments and then maybe go a little bit further into, different things you might read on this subject. So here's the setup. Bottom line, the central claim of Christianity is a historical claim. And so people should and can study historically this central claim that Jesus of Nazareth existed and that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate and that he rose from the dead. So essentially, that's what I want to talk about is what do you make of Jesus? I mean, everybody in one sense, if they want to be rational, if they want to be sort of serious and thoughtful about what they believe, you should reckon with who is Jesus. He's a huge figure in history. He's had massive impact, not only on the Western world, but on the whole world. And so everyone, if they want to be sort of intellectually credible, should probably really take time to carefully answer the question, who is Jesus? When you start doing that and going down that path, you're going to find there are only a few options, especially given the claims that Jesus made about himself and the claims that are sort of inherent in what people said about him and the life that he lived. And so it's very common today to sort of see Jesus as a very good moral teacher, but that's really not an option when we really take seriously Jesus and his life. So let me just say there are four sort of options on the table, and then I basically, through a process of elimination, want to argue for the last one. So the first option is that Jesus is a liar. The second is that he is a lunatic. The third is that he is a legend. And then the last one is that he's actually the Lord. This is not a new argument to me. I'm not making this up. This has been made many times over the years, but I want to kind of summarize this argument and walk through those options. Let me just quickly set aside the first two that I think that right away we can say this can't be who Jesus was. And the first is that he's a liar. Essentially, if you take seriously the claims that Jesus made about himself, that he is God, that he could forgive sin, that he existed before he was born, things like that, you could say, well, that's fine. He claimed those things, but he was just a liar. But the reality is when you dig into his life and you look at the following he had and how intimately he lived with his disciples and even with the crowds, how open his life was, how out in front he was, it's not consistent to say he was just a liar. He was a fraud. He was trying to deceive everyone. He never backed down from his claims. He had opportunity before he was crucified to sort of say, hey, I made all this up, back away from claims being the Son of God. He didn't do that. And we see in his life, he didn't gain the sorts of things that frauds typically are after when, people make sort of outlandish claims about themselves, cult leaders and things like that. He wasn't after sex and power and money. None of those things were things he benefited in making these claims about who he was. And so bottom line, what you have to say about Jesus is that he was sincere. So he made these pretty big claims. People said, you're the Son of God. He didn't dispute that. And so it seems like he was sincere in what he was arguing. So that leads or what he was claiming. So that leaves a second option, which is that he was a crazy person. He was a lunatic, right? I mean, a lot of people might be delusional and think they're God or something like that. And so that's what was going on with Jesus. But the reality is he really would not have been able to gain the sort of following that he gained and live the way he did if he was crazy. Again, he lived too intimately with other people for him to be a sort of unstable, delusional person. He traveled a lot. He was with crowds. He had intimate friends who saw every moment of his life. He talked and debated with some of the most intelligent people of his day, most educated people of his day. And again, if you look at sort of delusional people, they tend to be very isolated from others. They tend to live in pretty controlled environments and only interact under sort of controlled conditions. None of those things were true of Jesus. He lived out in the open with others. So the idea that Jesus was a moral teacher doesn't really work because he made some pretty big claims. So he would have to have been a liar or a lunatic, and neither one of those really fits with the portrait that we have of him in the Gospels. Now, of course, that leaves open a big question, which is, well, then, was he just a legend? And so what I want to do for the rest of this video and podcast is just argue that the best and most rational explanation of what we know about Jesus of Nazareth and the monumental rise of Christianity in the first century is that Jesus actually rose from the dead and is the Son of God. That's what I want to argue, and that means I need to tackle this idea that Jesus is really just a legend. So before I do that, we have to talk a little bit about history, because the whole argument here is that Jesus was just a legend. What we know about him is not really consistent with the real person, if there was a real person at all, right? So we're talking history. So let me just mention two quick things that are often brought up when it comes to sort of this historical argument about Jesus. And the first, and this is an increasingly common idea that you'll hear out there on the internet especially, is that Jesus didn't ever really even exist, that there's no good reason to believe Jesus actually walked the earth. What we know about this person is really more mythology. The problem is that almost no academics in the relevant fields of the ancient world and that time period believe this. There are several ancient sources of the time that mention Jesus's existence and his death by crucifixion, and these are not Christian sources. So we know the Roman historian Tacitus and Josephus both mention that Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. And Jesus is referenced in the early Christian movement was also referenced by Suetonius, another Roman historian. And so there's definitely good evidence that Jesus is an actual person that lived and then was crucified. What we can know that Jesus of Nazareth existed as surely as we can know almost anything else from this historical time period. So if you doubt his existence, you really have to start becoming a sort of radical skeptic when it comes to what we know about that time period and other figures in general. So let's, just kind of grant, I'm going to be operating on the assumption that it's a pretty rational position to believe that Jesus existed. The second is when we get to the issue of miracles. So obviously the Gospels describe miraculous events. And for some who study history, that is just out of bounds right off the bat. History, they would say, involves accepting the most probable explanations for events. And so miracles, by definition, are not probable, and therefore history writing can never accept the existence of miracles in historical accounts. And I think there are two problems with this argument, and I think there's good reason that we embrace the possibility that miracles have taken place when they've been witnessed by a lot of people. And the first is that this idea that history can't ever include miracles because that's not probable is essentially defining history in a particular way and then ruling out what's possible as a result of that. And there's really no reason to define and say history has to be done in this way. That's really sort of an assumption, a presupposition of modernity that essentially rules out the possibility that God exists and that miracles are possible from the beginning. And my whole argument that I want to make here is that actually there's good reason to believe the resurrection happened, and that actually might be the basis for why someone might come to accept the possibility that God exists. In fact, you'd almost be forced to believe that if you embrace the fact that the resurrection happened. So it's not fair to just describe history in a certain way and then rule out the possibility of miracles as a result of that. But secondly, when we talk about probability, we should, if we're going to be fair about it, we should look at probability as something that looks at the evidence of an event and not merely a general pattern of prior probability. So to say no one has ever been raised from the dead before, therefore it's never probable to assume that someone will be raised from the dead in the future, that's a mistake. So, for example, if there is a woman who gets murdered and the police come in, the probability that it's the husband that's killed her is high, right? When you look at statistics, it's likely that it's the husband who's the murderer. However, we don't just rule out every other possibility just because of that probability. We actually take time to look at the evidence, and then the probability that it's the husband is going to be dependent not just on what's happened in the past, prior probability, but on the actual evidence of this particular situation. And that's how we should treat accounts of miracles and something like the Gospels. We shouldn't just rule it out as improbable and therefore never to be allowed in history. We should actually look at the evidence for these events and consider what the best explanation is. And so what I'm saying is, to be rational, we've got to reckon with the fact that Jesus of Nazareth lived. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was buried in this tomb, which was a member of the Sanhedrin, Joseph of Arimathea. And so we can't just rule out his existence or the possibility of miracles altogether. So, was Jesus just a legend? Let's start with what we know, what we can all agree upon. What's the evidence that's available to everyone that we have to explain? Okay. First, as I just said, we know that Jesus of Nazareth existed as surely as we can know anything else historically from this time period. Secondly, we know the earliest Christians claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. We know this because of the early creeds that were formulated in the early church, that were included in the earliest letters of the New Testament that took place, or that were written about 15 to 20 years after Christ's death. Thirdly, we know that the movement gained followers in the very place where Jesus' resurrection could be proven untrue if it was untrue, right? The earliest followers, the largest amount of growth early on came from Jerusalem, which is where Jesus was crucified and where he was buried, so they could easily shown the body and sort of stop the whole movement if they wanted to. But that's where Christianity grew. And then fourthly, we know that Christianity grew to tens of thousands of followers throughout the Roman Empire in just a few decades. And then much more than that over the next 100 years. It rapidly expanded and grew and spread out through the entire empire. We also know, fifthly, that the Gospels contain elements that, if fictional, would not likely be there if the early leaders sought to perpetuate a hoax, right? So, for instance, the Gospels say that there were women who were the earliest witnesses of the resurrection. In that day and age, women were not seen as credible witnesses in the court of law. If you were making this up, you would not have the women being the first witnesses. The Gospels also contain the failure and many other embarrassing things about the men who were leading the early movement as its leaders. That's not what you do if you were, starting a hoax. You wouldn't include this embarrassment of the leaders of the movement in the main materials that you wrote about the movement. You wouldn't have picked a message that would challenge everyone in every place and require a break from a comfortable way of life. I mean, the gospel message of Christianity is radically opposed to the sort of Roman ideas at the time that valued status and honor, that thought bodily resurrection was crazy because, they all saw the soul as something that needed to escape the body. Crucifixion was seen as weakness. I mean, the gospel was radically offensive and to Romans. It was also offensive and ridiculous to Jews who would not, they did not expect God's Messiah, the chosen one, to come and be cursed by God on a cross. And so the message of Christianity is not one you'd make up. It's not what you'd choose if you were trying to start a whole movement and it was a hoax. Sixth, we know that the apostles sincerely believed their claims. Now, I say that because most of them were killed for their faith. They did not gain a lot by being leaders in this early movement. None of them, just like Jesus, sought riches or fame or sex or power. They weren't getting a lot out of this, and so what would motivate them to just make all this up? It seems they very clearly, sincerely believed what they were teaching, and there's no evidence that any of them changed their story over the course of their life. And then seventh, lastly, we know that Jesus's brothers, James, Jude, maybe some others, were skeptical of Jesus until after his resurrection. And Paul, who was an enemy of Christianity, persecuting the church, even killing Christians, he also converted when he claims he encountered the risen Jesus Christ. And so you have several figures who were opponents of this movement, who had nothing to gain by switching over and joining Christianity. Paul had so much going for him at the time as a sort of high up in the religious establishment of the day. He had nothing to gain in switching sides. He sincerely must have believed that he encountered the risen Jesus. So there were people who were opponents of Christianity who ended up converting after claiming that they encountered the risen Jesus. So that's what we're working with. That what everyone needs to do is be able to account for those things. How can we best account for that evidence? There's a number of theories that I want to explore. So the main theories that have been posited over the years to explain this evidence are as follows. One is the hallucination theory. Two is the hoax theory or the conspiracy theory. And three is the myth theory. So first, let's talk about the hallucination theory. This has been suggested by quite a number of people in different religions, but even in the sort of New Testament scholarship field, a lot of folks argue that, yes, the disciples were sincere, but because of their grief or some other reason, the disciples truly but wrongly thought they saw the resurrected Christ. And so, they hallucinated. That's the idea. However, this is a bad explanation, and the reason for that is that group hallucinations are incredibly rare, if not non-existent, and several of the accounts in the New Testament suggest that these appearances took place in groups, and more than that, they weren't just appearances, but whole interactions and conversations and meals and even touching Jesus. And so the idea that a whole bunch of people, up to 500 people at once, had a hallucination about Jesus that was so vivid and real, where they were touching him and eating with him and conversing with him, is highly unlikely. Psychiatrists and psychologists don't have a single documented case of a sort of mass group hallucination where a group of more than one person shares in some sort of vision and also the same interpretation of that vision, where there isn't actually some referent to that experience. And so there's no evidence that any sort of group mass hallucination like this has ever happened. And so that's a theory that doesn't seem to be a very good explanation for what took place. The second theory is what you might call the hoax or the conspiracy theory, and that's the idea that the disciples made up the story about Jesus and they lied about the resurrection for their own gain. Now, this would take an incredible amount of control and motivation, right? I mean, we know that not a single apostle recanted his beliefs, despite all the suffering that they endured. There's no record of a single early witness, which again, there were up to 500 of them, claiming that they made all this up. So imagine trying to control that many people and keep everybody on the same page, despite the suffering that people went through and without any sort of clear motivating gain that they might get from this. And that's a critical point. I mean, why would they make this up? They didn't gain sex, money, power from proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. And instead, most of them suffered greatly, died because of what they were preaching. You could also say, well, what strategy would they employ if they were making it up? And like I said a moment ago, the apostles included very embarrassing and inconvenient and even foolish details that would have undermined the very spread of the movement at the time if it was a hoax, right? The women witnesses, they mentioned their own cowardice and doubt and failure and misunderstanding in the Gospels. The message they sort of maybe made up, if that's what it is an incredibly unpopular one and difficult for people at that time to embrace. And so no group of conspirators would have ever made up these claims in that context. And then, of course, lastly, if it was all a hoax, again, it could have been falsified. If it was made up, the religious leaders of Rome could go and get the body. And they did not do this. And Christianity grew in the very place, Jerusalem, where they could have easily disproven it and said, this is all a hoax, here's Jesus's body, right? Many of the apostles remained in Jerusalem for decades. So they were there, and they could have been refuted at any point. But it's interesting because what we know from the early data, both in the Bible and outside of it, is that everyone agreed that there was an empty tomb. That was agreed upon by all parties, is that there was an empty tomb. And you have to ask yourself, well, how could the body have been stolen? Well, did Rome do that? Well, they had no reason to steal the body. That makes no sense. That Christianity was a trouble to them. They didn't give a rip about Jesus, especially right after he was crucified. They didn't think anything of it. There's no reason why they would have stolen the body. Could the Jews have stolen the body? Well, again, that did not serve their purposes as a religious establishment at all to steal the body. And so the question is, did the disciples do it? Well, they were racked by fear after Jesus' death. They were hiding in a room. The idea of resurrection was foreign to them. This idea that the Messiah of God, the chosen one of God, the one God anointed and fulfilled all his promises through, the idea that he would be raised from the dead, that he would be cursed and die and then raised from the dead, was not what they had in mind at all. And so what you would have to say is that for this to be a hoax, they would have had to have gone into this area of town where the Sanhedrin had a graveyard, because this man Joseph of Arimathea donated his tomb to Jesus. They would have to go to this area of town in the middle of Passover, where Jerusalem is flooded with pilgrims, and get this body and somehow move it somewhere without being noticed. That's how this hoax was perpetuated. It's a pretty absurd thing to posit. So Christianity could have easily been falsified if there wasn't an empty tomb. And the strategy for perpetuating this hoax was a very bad one. You have to ask yourself, what would motivate the disciples in doing this, and how could they keep such a strong control over all the people so that no one would ever deny it throughout their lives? The hoax theory, the conspiracy theory, just doesn't seem to fit with the evidence that we know of. So that leads to the third theory, which is the myth theory or the legend theory. And this is the idea that the portrayal of Jesus in the Gospels is not accurate. It reflects an oral tradition that developed decades after Jesus lived and died, and it really only reflects the thinking of this early Christian movement, and in many ways is maybe the result of arguments and conflicts the early movement was having. And so, you could basically say everything you've been saying thus far, Derek, is just based on the idea that the Bible gives us an accurate account, and I don't think that the Gospels do that. And one of the sort of analogies that's given to sort of explain how this could happen is a very common one, where people say, well, it's like the telephone game, and if you're familiar with that game, you'll know where this is going. But in that game, one person has a phrase that they whisper to the first person in a line of people, and they can only say one time this phrase, and then that person turns around and has to whisper to the second person one time in the line, and so on down the line. And then you get to the end of the line, and the last person tries to say the phrase and see if it matches what the original person said. And of course, everyone laughs because it's usually very different than what was initially said. And that's essentially what people have suggested is going on with the Gospels, is we have all these stories of Jesus that, over a few decades at least, developed and changed and sort of embellished who Jesus really was. The problem is that analogy is a really bad one when it comes to the composition of the Gospels. In the telephone game, you have a highly controlled set of rules, right? You can only say the phrase one time, and you have to whisper it, and that's it. And you have to hope it gets passed on. But that is not the way that things worked in the time of Jesus when it came to followers of key leaders who started schools and had disciples and all that. We have evidence of a number of other leaders at that time who started their own schools of thought, whether it's in the Greek world or in even the Jewish world with traveling rabbis, where we see movements like what Jesus started, essentially committing large bodies of material to memory. So, for instance, in the school of Epicurus, disciples, in order to just join the school, had to memorize, tens of paragraphs that were summaries of Epicurus's teachings, in order to just get in the school. They had to memorize these, and so these schools committed this stuff to memory, this body of material. And then as they got in, they had to learn a lot more than that. And these things were passed down to other disciples. This was a very common practice at that time. And so we have evidence in the New Testament itself that there were creeds like this, little bodies of material that summarized the Christian teaching that were passed down. Even much of the teaching material of Jesus and much of the material in the Gospels has this ring to it of the type of material that would be committed to writing and then memorization by the disciples of that movement. And so there's no good reason to think that the Gospels were constantly undergoing changes over time, and that they reflect sort of the debates and ideas of people tens of or dozens of years later, right? So that's not the sort of best way to understand what the Gospels are. In fact, we should see the Gospels as eyewitness testimony. That's what they essentially claim to be. Now, of course, you might say, well, not all eyewitnesses are reliable, and that's true. But under what conditions do we generally tend to be skeptical of eyewitnesses? Well, usually it's when events happen very quickly in a short amount of time and unexpectedly. We know that it's hard to accurately remember things in those conditions. We know when people are desperately trying to confirm something that they already believe, then they have a hard time remembering things accurately. When a weapon is involved and people are being threatened, we know that folks have a hard time remembering how an event unfolded. But none of those conditions apply to the life and ministry of Jesus. We're talking about a 3-year ministry where he traveled with his disciples, spent every day with them, teaching them, talking with them, living among them, and then teaching publicly in front of crowds and engaging lots of different characters. So you had multiple witnesses to the same events, and plenty of time to process those events, to remember those events, to even write down those events. There's no reason to suspect that there weren't any disciples writing down some of the teachings of Jesus as he went from place to place, maybe helping him craft some of his material as he taught. So the character and the details of the Gospels also evidence real events that are memories of people who actually witnessed them. If you read through the Gospels and you look at the way events are described, there are often details involved that seem superfluous to the narrative, but reflect the sort of thing that would be there if people are remembering events as they experience them. All the early church fathers claim that the Gospels were written by the apostles and those connected to them. We know that the Gospels contain and reflect the best practices of historiography in that day. What do I mean by that? Well, one example of this is how names are used as citations for the material in that part of the Gospel. So, for example, there's a kind of a famous moment where Jesus is going to the cross and he's carrying this beam and it's too heavy for him. And so the Roman soldiers grab a man named Simon of Cyrene, and they in the Gospels, one of them at least, it says, and this is the father of Rufus and so. I can't remember the other guy's name. And you're kind of like, why is that being mentioned? That seems a random detail. Well, it's because at that time, this is how you would sort of cite your source, and people who wanted to go confirm that actually happened could go find these people and ask, hey, did this take place? And of course, in this case, Rufus would say, yeah, Dad told us about that event our whole lives. We remember when he came home that day. This definitely happened, So that was a common practice at that time. And of course, if these people lived in or around Jerusalem, then when the Gospels were written, people could actually go and talk to the folks named in the Gospels and say, did these events happen like the Gospels claim? And so where the Gospels were circulated, people lived that could be talked to if the Gospels were in fact perpetuating hoaxes or embellishing what really took place in the life of Jesus. So, in terms of what theories make most sense of the evidence that we can all agree upon, it's unlikely that the resurrection of Jesus was a hallucination. It's unlikely that it was a hoax or conspiracy theory. It's unlikely that Jesus is just a myth and the portrait we have of Jesus in the Gospels is not accurate at all. And so what I think that means is that the best explanation for who Jesus is that he really is the Son of God who rose from the dead. How did Christianity get off the ground as a movement in Jerusalem and beyond if it wasn't true? I mean, like I said, it's not a hoax, a hallucination, or a myth. The best and most rational explanation is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And if that's true, if Jesus rose from the dead, as he predicted he would, he said he was going to be crucified and rise from the dead after 3 days, you have to ask yourself, how is it possible that happened, and what does that mean? That's the question that I've wrestled with, and Jesus made radical claims about himself, but he also made radical claims about you and about me. He claimed that we are created by God, that we are made to know God and to live in a world that is not broken. And he called everyone to believe in him as the one who would renew the world. And he did that by bearing death for us, which is the consequence of each of us going our own way, saying that our lives belong to us, living for ourselves, and turning away from the one who made us. And so Jesus died to bear the death that we have brought into the world, and the injustice and the brokenness. And he offers to everyone life in his name. And so just as he rose from the dead, he offers resurrection to each of us. That's what's on offer. And that's great news. You may not believe that, but that's the best news there could possibly be. And so I think you at least should want that to be true. And therefore, you ought to really take seriously the possibility that it is true and dig deeper into the sort of the argument and the claims that Jesus makes. I'd love to hear from you if you have thoughts about this or pushback or questions. You can make a comment here, or you can reach out to me through our email address, dradney@trinitychurchws.com, or if you know me personally, you can of course text me or call me. I'd love to talk about this. Hopefully this has been clear and charitable and fair. So thanks for paying attention, and take care.